March 11th, 2011, 2:46 p.m. I was standing inside one of the most advanced nuclear power plants in the world when the ground beneath my feet started to move. Not a tremor, not a shake. A violent, earth-shattering convulsion that would trigger the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. What I'm about to tell you isn't from news reports or documentaries. This is what I saw, what I felt, what I survived. This is my story from inside Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And I need to warn you, nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Hey everyone, before we dive in, I want you to understand something important. This isn't clickbait, this isn't exaggeration. On that day in March 2011, I was one of the few people who experienced the Fukushima disaster from the inside. As a safety inspector contractor working at the plant, I had clearance to be in areas most people will never see. And what unfolded over those terrifying hours changed everything I thought I knew about nuclear power, human resilience, and survival. So if you're ready for a first-hand account that's never been fully told before, hit that like button and buckle up. Because this story starts with the most powerful earthquake Japan had seen in over 1,000 years. That morning started like any other. I arrived at Fukushima Daiichi around 7 a.m., driving through the security gates I'd passed through hundreds of times before. The Pacific Ocean stretched out beyond the plant, calm and deceptively peaceful. The facility was massive. 6 reactor buildings spread across the complex, each one housing enough nuclear fuel to power entire cities. Unit 1 was the oldest, built in 1971. Units 2 and 3 were similar designs. Units 4, 5, and 6 were newer models. I grabbed my radiation badge, the small device that would measure any exposure, and clipped it to my chest. Standard procedure. We all wore them. Nobody thought much about radiation on a normal day at Fukushima. The plant had operated safely for decades. The Japanese nuclear industry was considered the gold standard worldwide. My assignment that day was routine. Inspect safety systems in the control room of Unit 2 and review some recent maintenance logs for Unit 3. I remember grabbing coffee from the break room. The TV was on in the background, showing some morning talk show. A few operators were discussing the upcoming weekend. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. At least, that's what we all believed. I was in the corridor between Units 2 and 3 when it started. 2:46 p.m. The first jolt almost knocked me off my feet. Now, I'd been in Japan for 3 years at this point. I'd felt earthquakes before. Small ones, medium ones. You get used to them living here. You learn to recognize the difference between a minor shake and something serious. This was different. The floor beneath me didn't just shake, it rolled like an ocean wave. The walls groaned, metal screeched against metal. Ceiling tiles started falling like rain, and it didn't stop. Most earthquakes last 5, maybe 10 seconds. You count them off, they pass, life goes on. This one kept going. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The entire building was swaying. I could hear people shouting, alarms starting to blare throughout the complex. Emergency lights flickered on as the main power wavered. I grabbed onto a handrail trying to stay upright. My mind was racing but also strangely calm. Training kicks in during moments like this. Get to safety. Follow protocol. Stay focused. 60 seconds. The earthquake was still going. This wasn't possible. Earthquakes don't last this long. 90 seconds. Equipment was crashing off shelves in nearby rooms. I could hear the deep, terrifying sound of structural concrete cracking. Somewhere in the distance, a window shattered. 120 seconds. 2 full minutes of the earth trying to tear itself apart. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the shaking. Here's what you need to understand about nuclear power plants. They're designed to shut down automatically during earthquakes. It's called a scram. The control rods drop into the reactor core, stopping the nuclear chain reaction almost instantly. And that's exactly what happened at Fukushima. All three operating reactors, units 1, 2, and 3, scrammed perfectly. The automatic systems worked exactly as designed. But here's the thing about nuclear reactors. Even when they're shut down, they don't just go cold. The nuclear fuel continues generating what's called decay heat for days, even weeks afterward. That heat has to be cooled, constantly, or the fuel rods overheat and then you get a meltdown. Cooling requires power, lots of it. The earthquake had knocked out the external power grid, but that's fine, that's expected. Nuclear plants have backup diesel generators for exactly this scenario. I made my way to the Unit 2 control room, joining the operators who were already implementing emergency procedures. The room was organized chaos, people calling out system statuses, checking instruments, confirming that the backup generators had kicked in. They had, all of them, exactly as designed. For about 45 minutes, everything was working. Tense, but working. We'd survived the worst earthquake in Japanese history, and our systems were holding. Then someone said the words that made my blood run cold. Tsunami warning, 15 meters, arriving in approximately 30 minutes. 15 meters, that's nearly 50 feet. The Fukushima Daiichi plant was protected by a seawall that was 10 meters high. Do the math. The tsunami warning system in Japan is incredibly sophisticated. They can detect underwater earthquakes and calculate wave heights with remarkable accuracy. But knowing something is coming and being able to stop it are two very different things. The plant managers immediately ordered a partial evacuation. Non-essential personnel were to leave the complex immediately. Essential operators, the people needed to maintain the cooling systems, would stay. As a contractor, I technically wasn't essential. I should have evacuated. But here's the truth. I wanted to help. These were my colleagues, my friends, and I had training that might be useful in the hours ahead. I made a choice. I stayed. We had about 20 minutes before the wave hit. 20 minutes to prepare for something none of us had ever experienced. The operators were focused on the reactors, monitoring temperatures, ensuring the cooling systems were running at full capacity. We knew the tsunami would likely damage some external infrastructure, but the reactor buildings themselves were solid concrete, built to withstand anything. Or so we thought. I was looking at a monitor showing the external security cameras when I saw it. The ocean had pulled back from the shore. Way back. The seafloor was exposed, something I'd only seen in documentaries about tsunamis. And then I saw the wave. It wasn't like the disaster movies. It wasn't a clean, curling wave like you'd see surfers riding. It was a churning wall of dark water, filled with debris, trees, boats, parts of buildings, cars. It was moving fast, impossibly fast. "Here it comes," someone whispered. The wave hit the seawall and just kept coming. The 10-meter barrier might as well have been made of paper. The water surged over it, rushing across the complex like a flash flood. We watched on the monitors as it slammed into the lower levels of the reactor buildings. Water sprayed up 60, 70 feet into the air. Transformers exploded in showers of sparks. Roads buckled, vehicles were tossed around like toys, and then the lights went out. Not flickering, not dimming, complete, total darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The normal background hum of the cooling systems, a sound so constant you stopped noticing it, was gone. Silence. One of the senior operators was already on the phone with the emergency response center. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain. All external power lost. Backup diesel generators. Status unknown, attempting to confirm. Someone ran in from the lower level, water dripping from his clothes. "The basement is flooding. The generators, they're underwater." And there it was. the cascade of failures that would turn a manageable emergency into a catastrophe. See, the diesel backup generators were positioned in the basement levels of the reactor buildings. It made sense from an engineering standpoint. Protect them from external threats, keep them secure. But nobody had planned for a tsunami that could flood those basement levels. The generators were drowning. The switchgear was drowning. Our backup power systems were being destroyed by millions of gallons of seawater. Without power, we couldn't run the cooling pumps. Without cooling pumps, the reactor cores would overheat. We had hours, maybe less, before the fuel rods began to melt. The shift supervisor's voice cut through the chaos. Implement emergency cooling procedures. I want battery-powered systems online now. I want every option on the table. People started moving with practiced urgency. This was a scenario we'd trained for, even though we'd never truly believed it would happen. But training and reality are different things. In training exercises, you don't have the ground still occasionally shaking with aftershocks. You don't have water seeping in through damaged doorways. You don't have the weight of knowing that if you fail, the consequences could affect millions of people. Here's a question for you. How long can you hold your breath underwater? 30 seconds? A minute? Maybe 2 minutes if you're really trained. Now imagine you're trying to fix a complex mechanical system while holding your breath. Every second counts. Every movement has to be precise. That's what we were facing, except our breath-holding was measured in hours, and the drowning was a nuclear meltdown. The reactor cores were still hot, incredibly hot, and getting hotter. We had some battery-powered instruments that showed us the core temperatures were rising. Slowly at first, but steadily. The water level in the reactor vessels was starting to drop as it boiled off. If the fuel rods became exposed to air, they'd heat up dramatically faster. Once they reached about 1,200 degrees Celsius, the zirconium cladding on the fuel rods would react with steam, producing hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas in a confined space, combined with oxygen. You know what that makes? A bomb. The operators were working frantically to find any way to get water into the reactors. We had fire trucks outside. Could we use those pumps? What about the seawater? Could we flood the reactors with ocean water as a last resort? Using seawater would essentially destroy the reactors forever. The salt would corrode everything, rendering the plants permanently inoperable. We're talking billions of dollars in damage. But what's a few $1 billion compared to a meltdown? The decision was made. Pump seawater into the reactors if necessary. But first, we needed to vent the pressure building up in the containment structures. The hydrogen being produced was accumulating, and the pressure was rising to dangerous levels. Venting meant releasing some radioactive material into the atmosphere. A controlled release versus an uncontrolled disaster. I watched senior engineers debate the decision for what felt like forever, but was probably less than 10 minutes. Every option was bad. They were trying to choose the least terrible path forward. This wasn't in the manual. This was judgment calls in real time with incomplete information and stakes that couldn't be higher. March 12th, early afternoon. I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. We all had. The efforts to vent Unit 1's containment had been partially successful, but the pressure situation was still critical. Operators were manually working valves that were supposed to be automatic, going into high radiation areas with minimal protection because there was no other choice. These weren't heroes in movies. These were engineers and technicians in their 40s and 50s. Some of them grandfathers who knew exactly what they were risking. I was in a different building when the first explosion happened. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, violent boom that rattled my bones. The building shook, not from an aftershock, but from the shockwave. My first thought was, the reactor exploded. Core breach. Meltdown. I ran toward the window and saw a massive cloud of dust and debris rising from Unit 1. The upper structure of the reactor building had been blown apart. Concrete panels, steel beams, insulation, all of it thrown outward by the force of the blast. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then the radio started crackling with reports. Injuries. People trying to confirm what just happened. Confusion about whether the containment vessel, the critical inner shell protecting the reactor core, was still intact. Here's what we would learn later. The hydrogen that had been building up in the reactor building had found an ignition source. The explosion destroyed the outer building, but miraculously left the primary containment intact. The reactor core was still contained. Barely. But it was a terrifying preview of how quickly things could spiral out of control. The evacuation zone around the plant was expanded. 3 kilometers, then 10 kilometers, then 20 kilometers. Hundreds of thousands of people were being told to leave their homes. Right now. Take what you can carry and go. And we were still inside, trying to prevent an even worse catastrophe. Let me tell you about the Fukushima 50. That's what the media ended up calling them, though there were actually more than 50 people who stayed. The number fluctuated as some were rotated out due to radiation exposure and others volunteered to rotate in. These were operators, engineers, technicians, and firefighters who stayed at the plant when everyone else evacuated. They knew the risks. They understood that every hour they spent in those radiation fields was potentially shaving years off their lives. And they stayed anyway. I met one operator, I'll call him Tanaka-san to protect his privacy, who was in his late 50s. He had grandchildren. He showed me pictures of them once, months before the disaster, beaming with pride. On March 13th, after the second day of crisis, I saw him suiting up to go into a highly contaminated area to manually operate a valve. His radiation dosimeter was already showing elevated exposure. "Tanaka-san," I said, "you've already done more than enough. Let someone else take this one." He looked at me with this calm, resolved expression. "If not me, then who? The younger ones have more life ahead. I've already lived well. This is what I can do." He went in, completed the task, and came back out. His dosimeter was screaming. He'd absorbed what would normally be considered several years' worth of radiation exposure in about 30 minutes. He just took off the protective gear, logged the exposure, and went back to work on the next problem. That's who these people were. Multiply that story by 50, by 100, by however many people cycled through that plant in those critical days, and you start to understand the magnitude of human courage on display. The Western media talked about the explosions, the radiation, the disaster. They didn't talk enough about the people who prevented it from being so much worse. People who stayed when every instinct screamed to run, who chose possible death from radiation to protect millions of strangers they'd never meet. I'm getting emotional, just remembering it. March 14th brought another explosion, this time at Unit 3. This one was worse. Much worse. The blast was more powerful, throwing debris hundreds of feet into the air. The mushroom-shaped cloud that rose from the building made everyone's worst fears seem real. Was this it? Had we lost containment? Was the core exposed to the environment? The radiation readings across the plant spiked dramatically. Areas that had been relatively safe became danger zones. We had to evacuate even more personnel, pulling back to buildings farther from the damaged units. Communication was getting harder. Phone lines were down, internet was spotty. We were relying on radio communications and runners physically carrying messages between buildings. And the aftershocks kept coming. Every few hours, the ground would shake again, reminding us that the original earthquake wasn't finished with us yet. One aftershock, I think it was a magnitude 6.4, hit while I was climbing stairs in one of the administrative buildings. The stairwell started swaying so violently I had to grab the handrail with both hands and just hold on until it passed. You start to lose your sense of normal when the ground beneath you can't be trusted, when air itself might be carrying invisible particles that can damage your DNA, when every decision might be the difference between controlled crisis and uncontrolled catastrophe. I'd been wearing the same clothes for 3 days, sleeping in brief, fitful bursts on a conference room floor, eating emergency rations that tasted like cardboard. My radiation badge had been replaced twice, The accumulated dose was higher than I'd ever experienced in my entire career, and we still weren't sure if we were winning or losing this battle. Here's something most people don't know about the Fukushima response. Concrete pump trucks saved the day, not advanced robotics, not military technology, not some sophisticated nuclear engineering solution. Concrete pump trucks, the kind used at construction sites to pour concrete into hard-to-reach places. Someone, and I wish I knew who had this brilliant idea, realized these trucks had long booms that could spray water from a safe distance. They could reach over the damaged reactor buildings and drop water directly onto the exposed fuel pools. The spent fuel pools were another nightmare we were dealing with. These pools, located in the upper parts of the reactor buildings, held thousands of used fuel rods that still generated tremendous heat. They needed water. Constantly. When the explosions damaged the buildings, there was real concern that these pools could drain, exposing the fuel rods to air. If that happened, the rods would heat up, potentially catch fire, and release massive amounts of radiation. It would be Chernobyl-level bad, maybe worse. So they brought in these concrete pump trucks, painted them with the company logo still visible, and started spraying thousands of gallons of water onto the damaged buildings. I watched one of these operations from a distance. The truck would extend its boom, some of them could reach over 60 meters, and just start pouring water, gallons and gallons and gallons. It was crude, it was improvised, it was desperate, and it worked. The fuel pools stayed cool enough. The crisis, while far from over, stopped accelerating toward complete catastrophe. But here's what haunted me. We were using construction equipment to fight a nuclear disaster. This wasn't supposed to be possible at a modern nuclear facility. Every safety system had multiple redundancies. Every scenario had been planned for, except this one. We'd prepared for earthquakes. We'd prepared for equipment failures. We'd prepared for human error. We hadn't prepared for an earthquake and a tsunami and multiple simultaneous failures across multiple reactor units. The complexity defeated our planning. Radiation is terrifying because you can't sense it. You can't see it, can't smell it, can't feel it, can't taste it. There's no immediate feedback that tells you you're being exposed. No pain, no discomfort. It's completely invisible and silent. The only way you know you've been exposed is from the dosimeter you're wearing, and by then it's already happened. The damage is done. The clock is ticking on health effects that might not show up for years or decades. We were all checking our dosimeters obsessively. Every hour, sometimes more. Watching the numbers climb. The psychological toll was immense. Every time you took a breath, you wondered, am I inhaling particles right now? Is this the breath that gives me cancer 20 years from now? Every time you touched a surface, you wondered, is this contaminated? Did I just get particles on my hands that I'll accidentally ingest later? The paranoia was exhausting. And the worst part, it was rational paranoia. These weren't unfounded fears. The danger was real. I remember one night, I think it was March 15th or 16th, sitting in a makeshift sleeping area with a few other workers. We were talking quietly, too wired to sleep despite being exhausted. One guy, an engineer from Tokyo Electric Power Company, said something that stuck with me. You know what's strange? If I die from this, it won't be today or tomorrow. It'll be years from now. Maybe I'll get leukemia when I'm 65. Maybe I'll develop thyroid cancer. Or maybe nothing happens and I live to 90. I won't know which future is mine for decades. That uncertainty is a special kind of torture. We were all making choices that would affect our health for the rest of our lives, and we wouldn't know the consequences for years. But we kept working anyway. What else could we do? I stayed at Fukushima Daiichi for 5 days total. On March 16th, my supervisor, someone from the contracting company I worked for, basically ordered me to evacuate. My accumulated radiation exposure had crossed a threshold that made the company's lawyers nervous. I didn't want to leave. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. I felt like abandoning the team. These people had become like family over those intense days. We'd survived something together that most people couldn't imagine, but I also knew I was becoming a liability. If I got a dangerous dose of radiation, I'd become someone who needed rescue rather than someone who could help. So I left. The evacuation process was surreal. A bus took us away from the plant, through the abandoned towns in the evacuation zone. Empty streets, abandoned cars, pets wandering loose looking for their owners who weren't coming back. We passed through several radiation checkpoints where we were scanned for contamination. My clothes were confiscated, too contaminated to keep. I had to shower multiple times with special soap designed to remove radioactive particles. Even after all that, my body still showed elevated radiation levels. Not dangerous for the people around me, but enough that I'd be flagged at radiation detectors for months afterward. I ended up in a temporary shelter about 80 kilometers from the plant. Just rows and rows of cots in a gymnasium filled with evacuees. Families who'd lost everything. Elderly people who'd left homes they'd lived in for 50 years with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And I felt guilty. Guilty for leaving when others were still at the plant. Guilty for being alive and healthy when others had been injured or exposed to worse radiation. Guilty for having a future when so many people's futures had been destroyed. Survivor's guilt is real, folks. It doesn't care about logic. The Fukushima disaster didn't end when I left. The crisis continued for weeks, months. It took until December 2011, 9 months after the earthquake, before the government officially declared the reactors in cold shutdown, meaning the fuel had cooled enough that a runaway reaction was no longer possible. But the cleanup, that's still ongoing. Today, right now as you're watching this, the plant is still there, permanently damaged. Thousands of workers go to the site every day, working on decontamination, water management, and eventually, maybe by the 2040s or 2050s, they'll begin the actual decommissioning process. There are over 1,000 storage tanks filled with treated radioactive water. They're running out of space to store it. The question of what to do with that water is still being debated. The evacuation zone? Parts of it have been reopened, but many areas are still restricted. Towns that existed for centuries are now ghost towns, slowly being reclaimed by nature. About 160,000 people were evacuated. Many of them never returned. How do you rebuild your life when your home, your community, your history is in a radioactive exclusion zone? The psychological trauma extends far beyond the people who are directly affected. The entire nation grappled with questions about nuclear power, about trust in government and corporations, about the costs of modern energy production. Japan shut down all of its nuclear reactors after Fukushima. A nation that got 30% of its electricity from nuclear power went to zero almost overnight. Some have since restarted, but the debate continues. Was Fukushima an aberration, a once-in-a-thousand-years event that we can learn from and prevent in the future? Or was it a warning that some technologies, no matter how carefully designed, carry risks we can't fully control? I don't have the answer. I'm not sure anyone does. Let me share what surviving Fukushima taught me. First, nature is more powerful than any human engineering. We can build incredible things, but we can't control earthquakes or tsunamis. The best we can do is prepare, and hope it's enough. Second, human beings are capable of extraordinary courage. I saw people sacrifice their health and possibly their lives for strangers. No hesitation, just duty and honor and compassion. Third, complex systems fail in complex ways. It's never just one thing. It's a cascade, a series of small failures that combine into catastrophe. We can't predict every possible combination. Fourth, transparency matters. One of the lasting controversies of Fukushima was how long it took to get accurate information out to the public. People lost trust because they felt they weren't being told the truth about radiation levels and risks. Fifth, The human cost of disasters extends far beyond the immediate deaths and injuries. The psychological trauma, the displaced communities, the shattered trust. These wounds take generations to heal, and finally, we're all connected. What happened at Fukushima affected the entire world. Radiation doesn't respect borders. Fear doesn't respect borders. The consequences ripple outward in ways we're still discovering. You want to know what happened to me after Fukushima? I struggled. A lot. PTSD is real. For months afterward, I'd wake up at night thinking I felt the ground shaking. I'd hear a loud noise and my heart rate would spike. I'd see news about earthquakes anywhere in the world and feel this deep, visceral anxiety. I got angry a lot, at systems that failed, at corporations that cut corners, at anyone who treated what happened like a political talking point instead of a human tragedy. I felt disconnected from normal life. How do you care about traffic or petty work drama when you've seen what I saw? How do you complain about minor inconveniences when you know people who lost everything? I saw a therapist. It helped. Talking through the experience, processing the trauma, learning coping mechanisms for the anxiety. I also connected with other survivors. There's a bond between people who've been through something like this. We don't have to explain. We just understand. Physically, I get screened regularly for cancer. My radiation exposure was significant but not extreme compared to some of the workers who stayed longer. The doctors say my risk is elevated but not dramatically so, but I won't know for sure until I'm older. That uncertainty I mentioned earlier, I live with it every day. Would I do it again? Would I stay at that plant knowing the risks? Yes. Without hesitation, yes. Because the alternative, leaving my colleagues to face that crisis alone, walking away when I might have been able to help, that would have been harder to live with than any amount of radiation exposure. I want to come back to the Fukushima 50 because their story deserves more attention. Many of them developed serious health problems. Some died, though it's complicated to determine which deaths were directly caused by radiation versus other factors. In Japan, there's a concept called gaman, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. These workers embodied that principle. They didn't seek fame or recognition. Most of them avoided media attention. They just did their jobs under circumstances that were as close to hell as you can imagine. Some of them were ostracized afterward. Can you believe that? People who sacrificed their health to prevent a worse disaster were treated like pariahs because they were associated with the nuclear industry. Others were celebrated as heroes, but quietly. Japan doesn't do loud heroism like some Western cultures. The recognition was respectful, subdued. I think about these people often, wonder how they're doing, whether they have regrets, whether they feel proud of what they accomplished, or are still haunted by what they couldn't prevent. A few of them I've stayed in touch with. We exchange emails occasionally, short messages, usually around the anniversary of the disaster. Still here, still standing. Remember, that's usually all that needs to be said. Fukushima changed the world's relationship with nuclear power. Germany announced it would phase out nuclear energy completely. Italy abandoned plans for new reactors. Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, all made moves away from nuclear. The global nuclear industry, which had been experiencing a nuclear renaissance before 2011, suddenly faced massive headwinds. Planned reactors were cancelled. Safety requirements were dramatically increased. The economics of nuclear power became even more challenging. But here's the complicated part. Fossil fuels filled the gap. When countries shut down nuclear plants, they often replaced that power with natural gas or coal. Carbon emissions increased, air pollution increased. Climate scientists started pointing out that nuclear power, despite its risks, produces massive amounts of carbon-free electricity. Could the world fight climate change without it? The debate continues. It's not simple. It's not black and white. Fukushima showed us the risks of nuclear power in stark, terrifying detail. But climate change shows us the risks of continuing to burn fossil fuels. We're stuck between two different types of catastrophic risk. And I don't envy the people who have to make policy decisions with those trade-offs. In 2019, 8 years after the disaster, I went back to Fukushima. Not to the plant itself. I'm not cleared for that anymore. But to the surrounding areas, some of which had been partially reopened. It was eerie. Towns that had been bustling were now half empty. Buildings stood exactly as they were, left in March 2011, slowly deteriorating. I saw schools with children's backpacks still hanging on hooks, restaurants with place settings still on tables, homes with family photos on the walls, and gardens growing wild. It looked like the rapture had happened. People just vanished. Some residents had returned, mostly elderly people who decided they'd rather spend their remaining years in their home than die in some sterile apartment in a distant city. I met one woman, she must have been in her 70s, who'd come back to her farm. The government told her the soil was still contaminated, that she shouldn't grow food there. She was growing vegetables anyway. "I'm old," she told me with a smile. "If the radiation gives me cancer in 10 years, well, I'll be 90. What do I care? This is my land, my family's land for generations. I'm not leaving." That kind of stubbornness, that connection to place, is hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. But I understood. She was choosing dignity over safety, choosing meaning over mere survival. Walking through those abandoned areas, I felt this profound sadness, not just for what was lost, but for the fact that the world had largely moved on. Fukushima was news for a few weeks, maybe months. Then it became background noise. Then it was forgotten by most people. But for those who lived through it, for the displaced families and the workers who saved Japan and the communities that died, for us, it never ended. We carry it with us every day. Here's what frustrates me. We didn't learn enough from Fukushima. Don't get me wrong, nuclear safety standards improved worldwide. Plants made upgrades, procedures were reviewed. But the fundamental lesson, that complex systems can fail in unexpected ways, that we need to plan for scenarios beyond our worst-case planning. I'm not sure we really absorbed that. I look at other industries, I see the same overconfidence, the same assumption that because something hasn't happened, it won't happen. Until it does. And then everyone acts shocked and scrambles to respond and promises it'll never happen again. Until next time. I've become skeptical of anyone who says a system is perfectly safe, or that risks are fully under control. Perfect safety doesn't exist. Full control is an illusion. All we can do is minimize risks, prepare for failures, and hope we're lucky. That's not pessimism, that's realism. And maybe that realism could prevent the next disaster, if we're honest about limitations instead of pretending they don't exist. There's radiation in my body right now, probably will be for the rest of my life. Cesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years. Some of what I absorbed in March 2011 is still in my tissues, slowly decaying. It's not enough to hurt me in any immediate way. I'm not glowing, I'm not sick. But it's there, a permanent reminder. Sometimes I think about the individual atoms. Cesium nuclei embedded in my bones, my muscles, my organs. Each one eventually decaying, shooting out a beta particle that damages nearby cells. Most of the time, my body repairs that damage. That's what bodies do. But sometimes, maybe, the repair doesn't work perfectly. A mutation occurs. A cell starts dividing wrong, and maybe that becomes cancer 20 years from now. Or maybe it doesn't. I'll never know which damaged cell, if any, will be the one that causes problems. It's like living with a lottery ticket that might pay out in disease instead of money. Sounds grim when I put it that way, doesn't it? But honestly, I don't think about it most days. Life goes on. I have work to do, friends to see, experiences to have. I can't spend every day obsessing over invisible particles in my body. That would be a different kind of death, dying before you're actually dead because you're too afraid to live. You might be wondering why I'm sharing this now. Why tell this story years after it happened? A few reasons. First, because the people who were there deserve to be remembered. The workers who stayed, the emergency responders, the soldiers who helped with evacuation. Their courage shouldn't be forgotten. Second, because I think there are lessons in this story that go beyond nuclear power. Lessons about human resilience, about how we respond to crisis, about the cost of the technology we depend on. Third, because I needed to tell it for my own mental health, to process what happened, to make sense of it. And fourth, because I want you to understand that the things you read about in the news, the disasters, the crises, the catastrophes, those are made up of individual human experiences. Behind every statistic is a person. Behind every evacuation number is a family. Behind every radiation measurement is someone's body. When you read 154,000 people evacuated, try to imagine what that means. Multiply my story by 154,000. Different details, different circumstances, but the same basic trauma. That's the real scale of disaster. Not the numbers. The accumulated human experience. Let me paint you a picture of what Fukushima Daiichi looks like today, based on recent photos and reports. The damaged reactor buildings are partially enclosed in steel structures. Massive cranes loom over the site. Thousands of workers in white protective suits move around like astronauts exploring an alien planet. Those storage tanks I mentioned. They stretch as far as the eye can see, row after row of cylinders, each filled with treated radioactive water. The site is basically a massive industrial operation now. Not a power plant, a decades-long cleanup operation. They've removed some of the spent fuel from the damaged reactors. Each fuel rod assembly has to be carefully lifted out by remote-controlled machinery, a process that takes hours. Eventually, they'll have to deal with the melted fuel itself. The corium, that's what they call the mixture of melted nuclear fuel and structural materials. It's somewhere in the bottom of the reactor vessels, solidified into incredibly radioactive lumps. Nobody's quite sure how to remove it. The radiation levels are too high for humans to approach. Robots sent in have failed due to the extreme environment. It's a problem that might take 50 years to solve, or longer. The local environment is slowly recovering. Wildlife has actually thrived in the exclusion zone in the absence of humans. Wild boars roam through abandoned towns. Birds nest in empty buildings. Nature doesn't care about radiation the same way we do. Individual animals might get sick, but populations adapt. It's beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. I want to tell you about the people who never left the exclusion zone. Yes, there are people living there. Officially? No. The government evacuated everyone. But unofficially, there are elderly residents who return to their homes and refuse to leave again. They're called the nuclear gypsies sometimes, though that's not a respectful term. They prefer to just be called residents. Most of them are over 70. They figure, like the woman I mentioned earlier, that radiation cancer takes years to develop. They'd rather live in their homes for whatever time they have left than die in exile. The government mostly looks the other way. What are they going to do? Forcibly remove elderly people from their family homes. These residents grow vegetables, tend gardens, take care of the stray animals left behind. They've created small communities of stubborn survivors. I admire them, honestly. There's something defiant and dignified about choosing to stay. They reject the narrative that their land is dead or poisoned forever. To them, it's still home. Radiation levels have decreased significantly since 2011. Natural decay and remediation efforts have made many areas much less contaminated. But it'll never be truly clean again. Not in our lifetimes. Probably not in our grandchildren's lifetimes. And these elderly residents have made peace with that. They've accepted the risk as the cost of staying home. I respect that choice, even if I wouldn't make it myself. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. I know this is a long story. I know it's heavy, not exactly light entertainment. But I hope it's given you a glimpse into an experience that most people will never have, and hopefully never need to have. Here's what I want you to take away from this. 1. The world is more fragile than we like to admit. The systems we depend on, power grids, nuclear plants, hospitals, food supply chains, they all have failure modes we don't like to think about. 2. When systems fail, it's people who make the difference. Not technology. Not procedures. People making difficult choices with incomplete information. 3. Every disaster is a collection of individual human stories. Don't let the scale of tragedy make you forget that. 4. Courage often looks like ordinary people doing their jobs under extraordinary circumstances. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear radiation suits and dosimeters. 5. We're more resilient than we think, both individually and as a species. We survive things we didn't think we could survive. And 6. Life goes on, even after catastrophe, even after everything seems broken. People rebuild, they adapt, they find meaning and joy even in the aftermath of tragedy. That's not minimizing the pain or the loss, it's acknowledging the strength. I'm sometimes asked what happened to the people I worked with at Fukushima. The truth is, I don't know about most of them. We scattered to the winds after the crisis. Some continued working in the nuclear industry. Others left it entirely. A few died. Cancer, mostly. Whether it was caused by radiation exposure or would have happened anyway is impossible to say for certain. Tanaka-san, the older operator I mentioned. Last I heard, he was doing okay. Retired now. Spends time with his grandchildren. Doesn't talk much about Fukushima, according to mutual friends. Some of the younger operators I knew are still involved in the cleanup operation. They go to the site regularly, continuing the work we started during those desperate days in March 2011. I imagine it's both meaningful and difficult for them. Every day at the plant is a reminder of what happened, but it's also a chance to be part of the solution. The management, some of them faced legal consequences, criminal charges related to the disaster. Trials that dragged on for years. Were they responsible? Partially, maybe. They made decisions about plant design and tsunami defenses that proved inadequate. But they were also working within a system that prioritized cost-cutting and regulatory capture. A system that many people contributed to. Assigning blame for systemic failures is complicated. Satisfying for public anger, but not necessarily just. Every March 11th, I stop what I'm doing at 2:46 p.m. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I pause for a moment of silence. I think about that moment when the ground started shaking, when everything changed. I think about the people who didn't survive the tsunami, the nearly 20,000 who died that day, most of them having nothing to do with the nuclear plant. I think about the communities that disappeared, the lives that were upended, and I think about the workers who stayed, who fought a battle most people will never know the full scope of. In Japan, there are official ceremonies every anniversary. Government officials give speeches. Survivors share remembrances. But for me, the private moment of silence is more meaningful than any public ceremony. It's my way of saying, I remember, I bear witness. This happened, and it mattered. Because one of the dangers of tragedy is that we forget. The world moves on. New crises emerge, old disasters fade into history, but forgetting means we're more likely to repeat the same mistakes. So I remember. Every year, 2:46 p.m., March 11th. I stop and remember. Sometimes I think about what I'd tell myself on March 10th, 2011, the day before everything changed. Would I warn myself? Tell myself not to go to work the next day? Honestly, I don't think so. Because despite everything, The fear, the radiation exposure, the trauma. I'm not sorry I was there. I was part of something important. I helped, even in small ways. I witnessed human courage that inspired me for the rest of my life. If I'd stayed home, if I'd called in sick, I'd have avoided the danger. But I also would have avoided being part of the response, and I think I'd regret that more. What I would tell my younger self is this: take better care of your mental health afterward. Don't try to tough it out. Get help sooner, and maybe appreciate normal days more. The boring, uneventful days when nothing goes wrong. We take those for granted until we don't have them anymore. Fukushima happened because of an earthquake and tsunami, natural disasters. But it was also the result of human choices. Where to build the plant, how high to make the seawall, where to locate backup generators. Every engineering decision carries assumptions about risk, about what scenarios need to be planned for and which ones are so unlikely they can be ignored. The problem is, unlikely isn't the same as impossible. Fukushima's tsunami was called a once-in-a-thousand-years event. Maybe it was. But 1,000 years isn't infinity, and when you build infrastructure that will operate for decades, that has catastrophic failure modes, you need to plan for the really unlikely scenarios. Because unlikely events happen. Just ask anyone who's lived through one. This lesson applies beyond nuclear power. Climate change is creating once-in-a-thousand-years weather events every few years now. Infrastructure that was designed for historical climate patterns is failing. Sea walls that seemed adequate aren't anymore. Drainage systems are overwhelmed. Heat waves are deadlier. Droughts last longer. We're living in a world where the assumptions our infrastructure was built on are becoming obsolete. And I wonder, how many more Fukushimas are we sleepwalking toward? How many systems are one unlikely event away from catastrophic failure? I don't have answers. I'm not a policy expert or a climate scientist, but I know what it looks like when protective systems fail. I've seen it, and I hope we can learn from these experiences before the next disaster, rather than after. Here's something that might surprise you. I'm not anti-nuclear power. I know. After everything I experienced, you'd think I'd want every nuclear plant in the world shut down immediately. But it's not that simple. Nuclear power, done right, produces massive amounts of clean energy. It's one of the few technologies we have that can generate baseload power without carbon emissions. Climate change is an existential threat, potentially bigger than any single nuclear accident. The question isn't whether nuclear power has risks. It does. Obviously. The question is, what are the alternatives and what are their risks? Coal power kills thousands of people every year through air pollution. It's destroying our climate. Natural gas is better but still contributes to climate change. Renewables are great but have limitations: intermittency, energy storage, land use. There's no perfect solution. Every energy source has trade-offs. What I learned from Fukushima is that we need to be honest about those trade-offs. We need to acknowledge the risks we're taking, whatever path we choose, and we need to invest in making things as safe as possible while accepting that perfect safety is impossible. New reactor designs are much safer than the ones at Fukushima. They have passive safety systems that don't require power to work. They're designed to fail in safer ways. Maybe those designs could reduce the risk to acceptable levels. Maybe not. But the conversation needs to be based on evidence and honest risk assessment, not fear or ideology. We're coming to the end of this story. Thank you for sticking with me. I started by saying this was about what I experienced inside Fukushima nuclear plant during the disaster. But really, this story is about more than that. It's about how we respond when systems fail. How we find courage when we're terrified. How we keep going when everything seems hopeless. It's about the people who do the difficult, dangerous work that keeps civilization running. The people who don't run away when disaster strikes, but run toward it. It's about the cost of the technologies we depend on and the difficult choices we face as we try to power our world while protecting our planet. And it's about resilience. both personal and collective. The earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 20,000 people. The nuclear disaster displaced 160,000 more. Communities were destroyed. Lives were shattered, but people survived. They rebuilt. They found ways to continue. That's not a happy ending exactly. Too much was lost for that. But it's a testament to human strength, to our capacity to endure and adapt and eventually find meaning even after catastrophe. I carry Fukushima with me every day, in my memories, in my body, in how I see the world. But I also carry forward the lessons I learned there, about courage, about compassion, about doing what needs to be done even when you're scared. Those lessons have value. They make me better at helping others, more empathetic, more aware of the fragility and preciousness of normal life. So while I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, I also don't regret having gone through it. It made me who I am. If this story affected you, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. More importantly, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced a disaster or crisis? How did it change you? What lessons did you learn? And if you know someone who worked in emergency response, disaster recovery, or any of the difficult jobs that involve risk to help others, thank them. Their work matters more than most people realize. There are links in the description to organizations supporting Fukushima survivors and cleanup workers. If you feel moved to help, that would mean a lot. Finally, remember, the world is more fragile than we like to admit, but people are more resilient than we give them credit for. Take care of each other, be prepared, and don't take normal days for granted. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.